He didn't fight back. He didn't even raise his voice, but when a white cop lied under oath and accused him of attacking this 17-year-old black teen, refused to let the truth be buried, even if it meant standing alone in court. What happens when silence isn't weakness, but a weapon? If this story grabs your heart, already drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories like this one. Now let me take you back to the moment it all began. It was supposed to be just another quiet afternoon. The sun hung low over the rooftops of a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind with manicured lawns, security cameras on every corner, and an unspoken rule that outsiders don't linger too long. Jaden Harris, 17 years old, stepped off the bus just a few blocks from where his cousin lived. He wasn't in a rush. He had time before dinner, so he decided to walk to the corner store to grab a bottle of water and a bag of chips. Jaden wore a simple gray hoodie headphones in his ears and a calm, steady expression on his face, the kind of face that didn't ask for attention. He moved like someone used to blending in, or at least trying to. But even in his stillness, people noticed him. As he passed a dog-walking couple, the woman's hand tightened on the leash. A man getting into his SUV glanced once, then again, a little too long. Behind the counter of the store, the cashier suddenly stopped wiping the glass and watched him approach through the window. Jaden felt the weight of their stares, but he didn't flinch. He didn't speak. He just adjusted the volume on his headphones and kept walking. No one in that neighborhood knew who Jaden was, and he didn't feel the need to explain. Because sometimes silence is easier than defending your right to exist. But what none of them could have known not that day was that in less than 10 minutes, one of them would call the police, and Jaden's entire life would shift. From quiet afternoon to courtroom headline. Jaden had just stepped out of the store, a chilled bottle of water in one hand, a small bag of chips in the other. He paused for a second by the curb, looking down at his phone, trying to find a message from his cousin. Their house was only a few blocks away, but Jaden wasn't sure if he should head over or wait. That's when the headlights flashed. A black and white patrol car rolled slowly to the curb. It stopped, the engine still running. Officer Kent Riley, a white cop in his early 50s with a thick neck and sharper eyes, stepped out. His belt clanked slightly as he approached, hand already on his flashlight. He didn't ask if Jaden was okay. He didn't greet him. He didn't even introduce himself. He walked up fast and hard like Jaden owed him an explanation just for standing there. Then came the beam of light, blinding and cold, straight into Jaden's face. "What are you doing here?" Jaden blinked against the glare, slowly pulling one earbud out. His voice stayed calm. "Just waiting. My cousin's picking me up." Riley didn't lower the light. He took a half step closer. "Don't play games with me. You live around here." Jaden looked him in the eye, still steady. "No, sir. But I'm not doing anything wrong." That word, sir, it wasn't sarcastic, it was cautious. Measured, Jaden had been taught to use it like armor. But to Officer Riley, that answer felt like defiance. "I asked you a question," he snapped, "and I expect an answer that makes sense, you loitering, scouting cars." He glanced at the nearby black sedan parked beside Jaden, an expensive one, shiny and spotless. Not his. Jaden hadn't even noticed it. "You got ID?" Riley barked. Jaden hesitated, reaching slowly toward his back pocket. But before he could even pull it out, Riley lunged forward. "Hands where I can see them." People think the first moment of violence is always loud. A shout, a struggle, maybe a punch. But this wasn't like that. It was quiet, swift, surgical. Riley grabbed Jaden by the wrist, twisted his arm behind his back, and shoved him against the metal door of the store. The bottle of water hit the ground, rolled into the gutter. Jaden gritted his teeth, but didn't resist, didn't yell, didn't jerk away. But none of that mattered. Within seconds, Riley had him cuffed. And by the time backup arrived, the story had already been told, not by truth, but by assumption. Suspect refused to identify. "Got aggressive, reached toward my weapon," Riley said into his radio. "Possible attempted disarm. Resisting arrest." Jaden said nothing. No one around had seen what really happened. There were no witnesses, no camera phones pointed in his direction. Just a quiet boy in a hoodie shoved into the back of a squad car, and a white cop who now had a story to protect. The ride to the station was quiet. Jaden sat in the back of the patrol car, wrists cuffed tightly behind him, the rough plastic seat pressing into his spine. The car smelled like old sweat and stale coffee, and the silence felt louder than any siren. Officer Riley didn't say a word. He didn't have to. He'd already decided who Jaden was. At the station, the booking process was cold and efficient. No one asked if Jaden was okay. No one looked him in the eye. They just followed protocol. Fingerprints, mugshot paperwork. Charge assault on a law enforcement officer. Secondary charge, attempted theft, suspicious behavior near a high-value vehicle. Narrative report. Subject became aggressive during routine questioning, ignored commands, reached near officer's firearm, suspected intention to steal nearby vehicle. All written and signed by Officer Kent Riley. It didn't matter that there was no footage, no eyewitnesses, no real threat. All it took was the right words in the right boxes, and suddenly a teenager with snacks in his hand had become a danger to society on paper. Jaden sat in the holding room alone, hands still cuffed, staring at the stained wall in front of him. The room buzzed with a flickering fluorescent light overhead. Every few minutes, a distant printer spat out more reports, more truths that weren't true. A young officer walked in, clipboard in hand. He looked at Jaden for a moment, then scoffed. "You got a name, kid." Jaden didn't move, didn't blink. "You want to tell us who your parents are?" the officer asked, leaning against the table. Jaden turned his head slowly, calm but firm. "I choose to remain silent," the officer chuckled, shaking his head. Another one walked by, older, louder. "Let me guess. No priors, no ID, no address. One of those ghosts who just float into the wrong neighborhood at the wrong time." Jaden said nothing. "Well, ain't that something," the older cop muttered. "A boy with no name, no history, and a whole lot of attitude." They laughed, then left. Jaden stayed still, but inside something shifted. Not rage, not fear. Resolve, because they didn't know who they were holding. They thought he was just another kid in a hoodie with nowhere to be, and no one who'd care. They had no idea who his father was, and Jaden had no intention of telling them. Not yet. The courtroom was small. Old wood paneling lined the walls. A dusty flag stood next to the judge's bench, and the ceiling fan above creaked like it had seen more justice than the people in the room. But today it was packed. Locals filled the benches, some leaning forward with interest, others crossing their arms already convinced of Jaden's guilt. News had spread quickly. Black teen arrested in upscale neighborhood after violent encounter with officer. Officer Riley sat confidently at the plaintiff's table, clean-shaven and polished in his uniform. He looked relaxed, like a man used to winning, like someone who didn't think this would take long. Jaden sat on the opposite side, quietly composed. Next to him was Grace Daniels, a fresh-faced public defender who looked barely older than Jaden himself. She was earnest, organized, and clearly outmatched. But Jaden hadn't asked for a new lawyer. He didn't want special treatment, not even from his own father. When the judge entered the room hushed, "State versus Jaden Harris," the bailiff announced. Then came the performance. Officer Riley took the stand with practiced ease, his voice steady, his story clear. Too clear. The suspect became hostile. Almost immediately, he said, "I asked him a simple question, and he got defensive, aggressive. When I tried to de-escalate, he took a step toward me, raised his voice. Then when I attempted to place him under arrest, he reached toward my firearm." He paused, then added, "It was instinct training. I did what I had to do to protect the public." Some people in the audience nodded. One woman even whispered, "God bless him." Riley didn't acknowledge it, but the smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth said enough. Grace rose, clutching her notes. Her voice shook, but her words were clear. "Officer Riley, is there any body cam footage of this incident?" Unfortunately, Riley replied smoothly. The camera malfunctioned. "Any eyewitnesses?" It was a quiet street. No one was around. Grace hesitated. "So, we're relying entirely on your word." The prosecutor objected. The judge sustained. From there, the cross-examination fell apart. Grace tried. She questioned timelines, pushed back on details. But without evidence, it was like shadowboxing. And the prosecutor, a sharp-tongued man in his 40s, swooped in after each attempt, spinning Riley's words back into gospel. Jaden sat still, watching, listening, saying nothing. The judge glanced at him more than once, perhaps expecting an outburst, but Jaden didn't take the bait. After a short recess, Grace leaned over and whispered, "We could bring in your father. We could end this now." Jaden turned to her, eyes calm. "No." Grace blinked. "You don't have to protect anyone." "I'm not," he said quietly. "I just want the truth to matter, not a name." Grace nodded slowly and returned to her notes. And in that moment, in a courtroom tilted against him, Jaden made one thing clear without saying a word. He wasn't fighting to win easily. He was fighting to win right. That night, Grace sat alone in her office, a borrowed space inside the public defender's suite. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead, casting a cold glow on the piles of paperwork spread across her desk. She was exhausted. Defeated, the courtroom battle had left her drained, and Jaden's silence only added to the weight on her shoulders. She was just about to shut her laptop when the notification came. One new email subject line. "You might need this. No sender name, just a random string of letters." Grace hesitated, fingers hovering over the mouse. She glanced around the empty room, then clicked. There it was, a video rough, shaky, vertical shot through the windshield of a car parked across the street from the store. At first, the image was unclear, blurred shapes and flashes of movement. A figure in dark blue, another in gray. But the audio was sharp, unmistakable. Riley's voice, kids. Like you never learn unless they get slammed. Then Jaden's, I'm not resisting. Please let go of my arm. Grace sat, frozen, her hand slowly moving to cover her mouth. She played it again and again. The angle wasn't perfect. You couldn't clearly see Riley's face, but his voice, his tone, it was him. The contempt, the authority, the threat that had nothing to do with justice. The woman who filmed it had stayed quiet. No name, no explanation, just the truth finally cracking through the silence. Grace leaned back in her chair, heart pounding. This wasn't just a lifeline, it was a turning point. But she knew better than to rush it. The timing had to be perfect. She closed her laptop slowly and deliberately as if tucking away a secret weapon. Jaden hadn't asked for favors. He hadn't dropped his father's name. He'd stood alone, not because he was weak, but because he wanted the system to hear him for who he was. Now, for the first time since this all began, Grace felt something other than fear. She felt hope. And she knew when the moment came, this one video could change everything. The morning sun filtered through the narrow courthouse windows, painting streaks of light across the defense table. Grace Daniels sat with her elbows on a thick case file, her brows furrowed in thought. Jaden, as always, sat quietly beside her. Hoodie traded in for a clean button-up shirt, hands resting loosely in his lap. They were alone in the quiet moments before court resumed, and Grace finally asked the question that had been eating at her since day one. Jaden, she said softly, why haven't you told them who your father is? Jaden didn't look at her right away. He kept his gaze forward, fixed on the judge's empty bench. When he did speak, his voice was low, Daddy. Because if justice only comes when they find out who my father is, then was it ever really justice? Grace didn't reply. She blinked slowly, the weight of his words settling over her like fog. He wasn't trying to win by pressure. He wasn't trying to scare them with power. He was testing the system, seeing if it would do the right thing without being told who was watching. I want them to see me, Jaden said, not his shadow. Grace exhaled quietly and nodded. Meanwhile, across the room, Officer Riley was beginning to feel something he hadn't felt in years. Doubt. He sat at the prosecution table, flipping through his copy of the police report he himself had written, with conviction, confidence, and a dash of well-practiced phrasing, but it didn't feel as solid today. Whispers had started trickling into the courtroom. Reporters showing up with sharper questions, a few faces in the audience who looked too serious to be casual observers. And earlier that morning, Riley had overheard one of the junior clerks whisper, "You hear about that kid's dad? I think he's someone important in the Navy." That word Navy had stuck with him. He told himself it didn't matter, that it was probably just gossip. And even if it was true, he was the officer. He had the badge. The system protected men like him. Always had, but still, a tension had crept into his shoulders. A flicker of something behind the calm, because Jaden never raised his voice, never lashed out. He just looked at Riley, quiet, unwavering. And that silence, it was starting to feel louder than anything Riley had to say. The judge entered and court resumed. But everything had shifted just slightly. Jaden still sat in the same chair, still quiet, still composed. But now, even the courtroom seemed to lean in closer as if waiting for something. Not a name, not a title, but the truth. And it was coming. They just didn't know how soon court was back in session. Same room, same judge, same tension. But today, something in the air felt heavier, like the storm hadn't arrived yet. But every soul inside the courthouse could smell the rain coming. At the prosecution's request, Officer Kent Riley once again took the stand. He walked with purpose, sat tall, wore that same quiet smirk he'd worn on day one. The smirk of a man who believed the system still belonged to him. The prosecutor stood, buttoned his jacket, and began his questions. Officer Riley, to confirm, you maintain that the defendant was aggressive, attempted to reach for your weapon, and you responded as trained. That is correct, Riley replied smoothly. He was unpredictable, defiant. I feared for my safety. He didn't stumble once. His voice was clear, measured practice. Then, the door at the back of the courtroom creaked open. At first, no one turned. Just another observer arriving late. But then came the footsteps. Deliberate, heavy boots against old time. And then they saw him. A tall black man dressed in full Navy SEAL uniform stepped into the courtroom. Dark blue adorned with medals, a silver trident glinting on his chest. His posture spoke of discipline, command. Years of experience no courtroom could contain. He didn't say a word, didn't even glance toward the judge. He simply walked to the back row, sat down, and folded his hands in his lap. The room fell completely silent. Even the ceiling fan seemed to slow. Grace's eyes widened. Jaden didn't move, but his shoulders, which had been tense for days, dropped just slightly. Riley faltered mid-sentence. His eyes caught the man's face. Recognition flickered like lightning behind his stare. He knew that face, had seen it before. Years ago in a briefing, in a newspaper. In some formal reception he'd barely remembered, except for the way the room had changed when that man entered. Commander Samuel Harris, decorated SEAL intelligence liaison, national-level clearance, and most importantly, Jaden's father. But no one in the room said his name. They didn't need to. The uniform spoke louder than any introduction. Riley's voice tightened. As I was saying, but no one was listening now. All eyes were shifting, from Riley to the man in the back, and back again. A silent question hung in the air. What happens when the person you tried to bury has someone even the system fears? The judge glanced toward the back row. Briefly, a flicker of recognition passed over his features, but he said nothing. Commander Harris remained still, calm, observing, like a man who didn't need to raise his voice to shift the balance of power. And in that silence, one thing became clear. The courtroom didn't belong to Riley anymore. The tension inside the courtroom was like a wire pulled tight. Grace Daniels rose from her seat, slowly holding a small USB drive between her fingers. Her voice didn't rise, but it cut through the silence with clarity. Your Honor, the defense would like to present newly submitted video evidence captured by a bystander at the scene. Judge Grayson glanced toward the prosecution, then gave a slow nod. Let's see it. The bailiff inserted the drive and the room dimmed slightly as the screen flickered to life. What appeared was rough filmed from a car dashboard, partly obscured by glaring glass. But it was enough. Jaden was there, hoodie on, standing by the car. Then Riley entered the frame. There was no warning, no hesitation. He grabbed Jaden's wrist harshly, shoved him toward the vehicle. The boy stumbled off balance. Then came the words that silenced the room. Kids like you never learn unless they get slammed. And a beat later, Jaden's voice soft and steady. I'm not resisting. Please let go of my arm. A ripple moved through the crowd like wind through tall grass. Gasps. Sharp intakes of breath. The jury leaned forward. Even Judge Grayson paused his gavel, frozen midair. The video ended. The screen went dark. No one moved. Grace stepped forward again, turning slowly toward Officer Riley, who now sat pale and rigid on the stand. His shoulders had sunk an inch lower than they'd been before. Officer Riley, she said quietly, is that your voice we just heard? He opened his mouth, but nothing came out at first. He swallowed, then forced a hoarse reply. I was under pressure. I don't recall everything I said. Do you normally speak that way to minors? Grace asked, her tone flat. He looked to the prosecutor, searching for rescue. None came. It was a tense situation. I felt he stopped mid-sentence, realizing anything he said would only dig the hole deeper. From the back of the room, a chair scraped lightly across the floor. Heads turned. The man in the Navy SEAL uniform stood. He walked forward, not to the front, but just a few feet closer. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Your Honor, he said, addressing the bench directly. I'm Lieutenant Commander Elijah Harris, United States Navy retired, and I am the father of Jaden Harris. A hush fell so deep you could hear someone exhale in the gallery. Elijah continued, his voice controlled but layered with steel beneath. My son hasn't said a word about who I am because he wanted to stand here on his own. He wanted the truth to matter more than my name. His eyes didn't blink. They moved from the judge to the jury, then finally locked onto Riley. But when a man abuses his badge to demean a boy who did nothing wrong, when he lies to this court to preserve his own power, silence is no longer strength. It becomes surrender. He paused, his next words heavier than the last. Jaden is not just my son. He is an American citizen, and no citizen should have to be the child of a Navy SEAL to be treated with dignity. Behind him, the gallery was dead silent. Several jurors blinked rapidly, trying to process what they just witnessed. Not just the video, but the unwavering presence of a man who had led warriors and now stood here as a father. Elijah nodded once toward the judge. That's all I have to say. He returned to his seat, still calm, still composed, but the room had shifted. No one looked at Riley the same anymore. The system he had relied on to protect him now felt suddenly dangerously fragile. And for the first time since this trial began, truth had a voice louder than fear. The silence from Elijah's declaration still hung in the courtroom like smoke after a detonation. Then slowly he stepped forward again, this time with a thick folder in hand bound in worn leather. He looked directly at the judge. Your Honor, with the court's permission, I'd like to submit my military service record as context for who I am and why the truth matters here. Judge Grayson nodded, his face unreadable, but his voice firm. Granted, proceed. Elijah handed the folder to the bailiff, who walked it to the bench. As the judge leafed through the documents, the courtroom watched in stillness. 20 years of active duty, multiple deployments in high-conflict zones, commendations for leadership under fire, photos of Elijah leading rescue missions, commanding elite SEAL teams, and testifying before national security panels. He wasn't just someone's father. He was a man trusted to protect a nation. I've spent my life serving this country, Elijah said, turning now to face the jury, and I taught my son to serve in his own way with quiet strength. What happened to him was not a misunderstanding. It was profiling, it was abuse, and it was wrong. A few jurors nodded slightly. Others just stared at the documents in front of them, visibly shaken. Then Grace stood, and she didn't raise her voice either. She didn't need to. Your Honor, she began, we would like to submit a second folder. This one belongs to Officer Kent Riley. She handed it off, and the courtroom seemed to tense as if bracing for impact. Inside was a very different story. Internal affairs reports, civilian complaints, use of force warnings, allegations of racial bias, repeated recommendations for review, but no disciplinary action taken. Not once. Grace's tone sharpened, but she kept her pace deliberate. The prosecution has asked you to trust Officer Riley's word as a public servant. But how many warnings does it take before a pattern becomes undeniable? Riley shifted in his seat. Sweat had begun to bead at his temples. His attorney leaned toward him, whispering something, but Riley's eyes were fixed not on Grace, not on the judge, but on the folder in front of him. Let's talk plainly, Grace continued. Officer Riley has a documented history of aggressive behavior towards civilians, particularly young men of color. The system has shielded him until now. The room was still. We asked this court not only to see what Jaden endured that night, but to see the foundation that allowed it to happen. Judge Grayson looked over the documents, then slowly turned his gaze to Riley. Officer Riley, you may take the stand once more for cross-examination. Reluctantly, Riley rose. His steps no longer carried the swagger from earlier in the trial. He sat down like a man trying to shrink into his own skin. Grace approached, her voice calm, but pointed. Officer Riley, how many times has your use of force record been reviewed by Internal Affairs? I don't recall the exact number. More than 5 or 6. A pause. A slight nod. More than 10 times. Possibly, he muttered. And how many times were you held accountable? He stared at her. None. The silence that followed wasn't dramatic. It was devastating. Riley's voice began to crack under pressure. He stammered. He repeated himself. His eyes flicked nervously around the courtroom like a man looking for an escape route. Then Judge Grayson looked over toward Jaden. Mr. Harris, would you like to make a statement before we proceed to closing? Jaden stood slowly. He didn't look like someone about to give a speech. He looked like someone finally being allowed to breathe. He stepped forward, hands in his pockets, shoulders squared, face calm but voice laced with something deeper. Quiet. Courage. I didn't fight back that day. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't even flinch. He looked at Riley, then at the jury. I was just standing there by a car checking my phone. But somehow that with this skin was enough to be seen as a threat. A murmur ran through the gallery, but Jaden didn't pause. I didn't tell anyone who my dad was, because I wanted the truth to matter on its own. Not because I have someone powerful behind me, but because I didn't do anything wrong. His voice caught, but only for a second. I know I'm not the first kid to go through this. And I know I won't be the last, but maybe if the truth actually matters in this courtroom, maybe the next kid won't have to be silent. He stepped back, and in that moment, Jaden Harris wasn't just a defendant anymore. He was a voice the system had tried to silence and failed. The jury had been out for just under 2 hours, but to Jaden sitting quietly beside Grace, it felt like the world had paused mid-breath. The courtroom buzzed softly with nervous whispers as the 12 jurors filed back in. Each wore a look of heavy thought, their eyes avoiding Riley, who sat now hunched over his face, a pale shade of what it once was. Judge Grayson tapped the gavel lightly. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, have you reached a verdict? The foreperson, a middle-aged woman with graying hair and a steady gaze, stood. We have your honor. Please read the verdict. She unfolded a sheet of paper, and for a moment, the only sound in the room was the rustling of paper and the sound of hearts pounding. In the case of State versus Jaden Harris, we find the defendant not guilty on all counts. A wave of emotion swept through the courtroom. Grace closed her eyes briefly, exhaling the breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Elijah simply bowed his head, eyes closed as though offering a silent thank you to something greater. Jaden, sat still. No fist pump, no outburst, just a quiet release in his shoulders, the weight finally lifting. But the foreperson wasn't finished. Additionally, the jury recommends that the court open a formal investigation into Officer Kent Riley for perjury, abuse of power, and conduct unbecoming of law enforcement. Gasps echoed across the courtroom. Riley blinked rapidly. His hands trembled. He turned toward his attorney, who could only stare ahead in stunned silence. From the back of the room, Riley's fellow officers, who had once sat like a wall of silent support, now shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some looked down, others turned away entirely. The silence around Riley was no longer out of respect. It was isolation. He had stood proud, confident that the system would protect him, but now even the system had begun to turn. Judge Grayson nodded solemnly. This court acknowledges the jury's recommendation. The matter will be referred to the district attorney's office immediately. He banged the gavel once more. Court is adjourned. The room erupted not in chaos, but in a gentle thunder of emotion. Applause, tears, quiet embraces between strangers. And through it all, Jaden stood slowly. As he turned, Elijah stepped forward. No military stiffness, no grand gestures. Just a father, eyes brimming with quiet pride, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. You stayed silent, he said gently. Not out of fear, but out of self-respect. He paused, voice soft but full of meaning. I've worn the uniform for decades. We should fought wars I'll never speak of. But today, watching you face this the way you did, he shook his head, his voice tight with emotion. That took more strength than any battlefield I've ever seen. Jaden didn't say much, just nodded. And in that silence between them, something stronger than any metal passed from father to son. As they walked out of the courtroom, past flashing cameras, microphones, and murmurs of the crowd, Jaden held his head high. Not because the world finally knew who his father was, but because after everything, it finally knew who he was. Jaden didn't speak to the media. Not once. Outside the courthouse, microphones were pushed toward him, cameras blinking like frantic eyes hoping to capture emotion. But Jaden simply kept walking, steady, silent. He didn't need the spotlight. He never wanted it. At school the next morning, students gathered around the main hallway whispering about the trial, about the courtroom, about him. The bulletin board that usually held club flyers and football tryouts had one single sheet pinned to it. Typed in plain font, no name. Justice isn't loud. Sometimes it just stands still. No one had to ask who wrote it. They knew. Weeks passed, then word came Jaden Harris had been accepted into one of the country's most prestigious military academies. Recommendation letters had poured in, not just from Grace Daniels or local officials, but from senior military leaders who had read his story and saw in him a future built on integrity. He didn't win by shouting. He won by standing still when it mattered most. As for Elijah, he returned to base not long after the trial ended. But he didn't return as the quiet, anonymous commander he once was. His name had made its way into national headlines. Not for war, not for politics, but for something far more powerful. Fatherhood, integrity, and quiet courage. And across the country, Jaden's story began to take root. Shared in classrooms and legal seminars, in military ethics courses. A case study not of courtroom drama, but of human dignity and what it means to fight without raising your fists. In time, the noise faded, but the lesson remained, because some victories aren't about applause. They're about holding the line when everything tries to push you down. And in that quiet where strength doesn't need a microphone, justice stood, right where Jaden left it. Sometimes justice doesn't roar. It whispers. Jaden's story reminds us that strength isn't always loud and true. Courage doesn't always come with medals. It comes with patience, with restraint, and with the unshakable belief that the truth will rise no matter how long it takes. If this story moved you even just a little, please give it a like. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded that dignity doesn't require a spotlight. And don't forget to subscribe to Mr. Max Stories for more powerful human stories just like this one. Stories that don't just entertain, they leave you thinking long after the screen goes dark. Your support means the world to us. Every comment, every share, it's what fuels our team to keep bringing these stories to life with care and purpose. Thanks for being part of this journey. And remember, sometimes the quietest stand echoes the loudest.